today's Mishna Berurah class. Today's class, we are continuing in the laws of the Kriya Shema, and today we're going to talk about errors while reciting the Shema. So we talked a little bit about what happens when you don't read things correctly, but these are a different type of error. These are errors in terms of the actual reading itself, not in terms of the pronunciations, not in terms of when you forget to say something. These are errors that are in the actual parsha itself. Okay, it's not very long, but it is enough. It's enough. It's pretty involved. So let's go ahead and take a look at these laws as they go through here. So Siman 64 begins with, if you read it, what's known as lemafreya. Okay, if you read it, which basically means a later part before an earlier part. This means that it's not being read in the order it's written. So you read a later part before an earlier part. So you have not fulfilled the obligation. So you're reading the Shema, and you get through Ve'ahavta, and then you go through, let's say you put the mezuzah before the tefillin. Put the tefillin before the mezuzah instead of mezuzah before tefillin. In those verses, that doesn't work. However, and as we said last week, if you read V'hayam Shamoa before the other ones, right, or you read Ve'ahavta, that is, we're talking about reading the verses out of order, but the actual parsha itself, even though you're not supposed to do that, you can still fulfill the obligation. Okay? Because they're not next to each other in the Torah. So the problem is you don't want to go out of the way in which it is written in the Torah. That's what this halakha is referring to. So the Mishnah Berurah comments over here. He says the following. So the reason why we read it out of its proper order written in the Torah is because it says V'hayu hadvarim ha'eleh, and it says these words shall be as they are. V'havyasin Yeho is what the Hebrew is. They should be as they are. Okay, and so therefore, the parsha of Vayomer, the third one, which is about tzitzis, that one, even though it comes later, it should follow the same rule as well. So even though it's not part of the Shema, it's still part of this main enactment. So if you mess up the psukim, that's no good. And also if you mix up the letters, if you mix up the words inside the psukim, mess up the letters for sure, mess up the whole word. Now, we said that there's an exception that if you take one parsha, you take Vayomer or V'hayam, read it before Ve'ahavta, that's not the end of the world, but you shouldn't do that. So because the rabbis wanted you to read them in this order, do they require you to read it in this order? But that doesn't mean that it is completely ruined when you read one paragraph for the other paragraph. And the reason why they have it this way is so that way you say Shema first, that way you accept the yoke of heaven upon yourself before you discuss you should declare the unity of Hashem. So that way you should accept the mastery of Hashem of the world first, and then the requirement of fulfilling His mitzvahs. So it just makes sense to have it that way. But if you don't do it that way, it's not the end of the world. So that's what we say over there. Okay. So the words have to be in the right order. The psukim have to be in the right order. That's something else. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next halakha. It says over here, if you read the parsha and you make a mistake in it, okay, which is that you read one verse before another verse. That's what we're talking about over here. If you know where the error was, such as you read the whole thing, but you skipped the verse somewhere in the middle. So go back to the beginning of that verse and finish the parsha. And if you don't, also go to the beginning of the parsha. Then you should go to the beginning of the parsha. Okay? Now, that's when you make a mistake. So the Mishnah Berurah explains, what happens if you do this intentionally? Let's say you're skipping verses. If you skip a verse, then you have to start the whole thing over. Just like when you make the mistake in tefillah. It has to be an error, and therefore we're lenient on you. But if you make the mistake intentionally, then you have to start over from the beginning of that blessing. Okay? Or beginning of that paragraph in this case. Now, if you skip only one verse, that's when we have this rule. But let's say you skip a word. Okay, you just forgot to say a word. And you say V'haya Shmoa Tishmu El Mitzvah, not V'haya Im Shmoa, right? V'haya Shmoa, you skip the Im. If you skip a word, then you have to just go back to that word in the verse before you continue on. Okay, and then you finish from that spot. Okay, and so, but some people say that you have to always go back to the beginning of the verse. So really, to be fair to everybody, you should always go back to the beginning of the verse when you skip a word in it. Okay, and then we said also that when you miss the verse, you go and finish that part before moving on to the next one. Now, if you only read that one verse and then finish it, that would be the problem of the first halacha, which is kriya lemafreya. We're not allowed to read it out of order, so you have to start from there and then finish from there. Now, let's say you only realize it after you finish another parsha. So you only have to go back and reread that one parsha where you skipped the verse. Okay, because again, as we learned, the order of the parshios, the order of different paragraphs, is not the end of the world. So if you realize that you're reading Ve'ahavta and you skip one of the lines in there, or you read the wrong line, okay, about tefillin, for example, okay, so you read it incorrectly, you need to go back and correct it from the beginning of the correct verse. Okay, and so too, if you read, let's say you erred in V'ahavta and then go all the way to V'haya Im Shmoa, and then realize when you're finishing it, you skip something in V'ahavta, just go back and read V'ahavta, and finish that one, and then go on and continue to Vayomer. Without tzitzis. Okay, but when we said if you don't know where the error was, just know that there was a mistake. You have to start at the beginning of that parsha. Why? Because with the doubt, even if it was, somewhere in the middle, the idea is that you always have it taught in that one parsha. Okay? So since you're reading the Shema, the Mishnah Berurah explains you have to fix every little mistake. So here's how it would work. If you make a mistake in the first parsha, so you said Shema correctly, and you said Baruch Shem Kavod Mechus Olam Va'ed, and you don't know where the mistake was, so just go back to V'ahavta. Now, if you don't remember if you said Shema correctly, you're going to have to say Shema again, as we learned a couple of chapters before, because you didn't recite it. You didn't recite it with full intent to fulfill the mitzvah. So that's almost like not reading it. It's almost like skipping it. Okay, and then you have to start from the whole thing and go through it again. So in any other situation, that's what the rule would be as well. So if you forget to say Baruch Shem Kavod as well, you should have to go back and recite that as well. One other interesting halacha over here. So, as we just said over here, that if you have recited the Shema with full intent, and you just don't remember what verse you skipped, you should start from Ve'ahavta. But if you really just weren't paying attention to the Shema at all, you have to start at the beginning from the Shema. Okay, so that's what we say. And this is, if it's a doubt, if you said it with kavanah, that's what I wanted to add over here. If you're not sure, start from the beginning of Shema again. And the third halacha here, if you make a mistake in between the parshios, okay, so meaning you finished the parsha, but you don't remember which parsha you finished. Did you finish because V'ahavta and V'hayam Shemoah both end very similarly, so you can't remember which one it was. So therefore, you should start at V'hayam Shemoah. So the idea is that you can assume that you finished that, because you know that you fixed it. So the Berurah says, when does it work that you start with V'hayam Shemoah because you know you finished the first one? You have no idea, is when you have no idea which word you were saying at the end of the previous parsha, whether it was the end of the first parsha, end of the second parsha, and you haven't started the third parsha yet. If you started the third parsha, then you could assume that you finished the second parsha, because you can assume that you followed your normal pattern of reading. So this could happen if you this is like a real shacharis problem. It's your early shacharis problem. You're reading and all of a sudden you're just reading, and then that's when this would be most pertinent. Let's talk about we're in the fourth halacha. Okay, so we're getting into some specifics over here. So I mentioned earlier that the last couple of psukim, when it talks about tefillin and the two parshios, they have very similar language at the end, but they're not exactly the same. Okay, so we're going to go through some of these words. So if you're saying the word uchsav tam, and you don't remember which uchsav tam, whether it's the first paragraph or the second paragraph, so then you want to go back to the first paragraph. Okay, so in any place where it's basically this general rule is whenever you are not sure where you were in your place, you go back to that other parsha, even though you may not have been reading it inside. That doesn't matter. So if you are within those words, you start reading from there and then finish the first parsha. That case only applies if you haven't started saying the words at the end of the second parsha, L'man yirbu yimeichem v'yimei b'neichem al ha'adaman. Right, that's the end of the second one. But if you started saying that, then you don't have to go back, because the assumption is that you were following your normal pattern of reading, and you've stuck with the regular order, and you just had a memory issue at this point. So that's what the Shulchan Aruch holds. So the Mishnah Berurah asks the question: why don't we say the same rule in the Shulchan Aruch? Why ukshar tam? He says there is a slight difference. He says that with the first ukshar tam, you say kamatz in there because it is written as a singular word, and the second one is with a segol ukshar tem, which implies that it's plural. So even though it's written exactly the same, because the pronunciation is different, therefore you would know by your pronunciation in which paragraph you were in. And some people say that it's also not common to make a mistake in the middle of the verse, because you'll kind of know, since you say it so often, you'll kind of know when you've messed up your verse. But when you're at the end of it, and it's been a while, and you've been in this verse for a little bit, that's when you could most likely make the mistake. So if you went ahead and we said that if you start with the last line of the second paragraph, you don't have to go back. The Mishnah Berurah explains because what's happening is that you don't know if you're supposed to say. It's one thing to start saying it, and it's another thing to not be sure if you have to say Laman Yibru Yimechem. So, in this case, if you aren't sure whether you're supposed to go on to say it or not say it, since you think you have to say it, the Mishnah Berurah explains that you can continue saying it in the second paragraph and not have to go back to the first one. Because even though you're only thinking it, that suffices. Because your body is processing it in the normal way in which you would have accomplished the task. And for whatever reason, you had this lapse in memory, and you would not be skipping around unless it was a really grave error. And so, therefore, we also continue and say you don't have to go back to the beginning of the second section. Okay, now that is the Mishnah Berurah explains over here. This is talking about individuals who are reading it. But if you are reading it in shul with the minyan, and you can hear the person leading the services reciting the Shema, and you hear the shliach tzibur say, "Uchsav tam al mezuz b'secha v'yishrecha," right? And you can hear him finish the first paragraph, and then, or something along those lines, then you yourself can go there because you're hearing it from the shliach tzibur, and you know that you're going to be following along with that pace. And if you think it's the second one, if you hear as the shliach tzibur continues that it sounds like the second verse, then you should continue from there. Okay, and so as long as you're with that, because you can assume that you've been following along with them somewhat out of rote, and therefore you can rely on that fact that you're probably following them out of rote. Okay, and an interesting halacha is, so what if you mix up how you finish the blessings? So we said a couple of chapters ago that when you mess up the blessings, as long as you have the proper endings to them, it's going to be okay. But let's say you don't. So that's going to be dealt with in another 4 chapters in the Mishnah Berurah when you aren't sure where you are in the blessings. So we'll come back to that. And so the section was rather short, but there was a lot going on. So we're going to hold it here for today, and we will pick up next time with 65. So what happens if you find that when you get to shul, the congregation is reciting the Shema? What do you do? And we'll also talk about, since that's a short one, we'll try to get to 66 as well, which is when can you pause in the Shema, which is an interesting one to learn about, because that will teach you. We'll learn about when you can say hello to somebody specifically, but we'll also learn about when you can respond to the Kaddish and Kedusha. So we'll save that for our class for next week. Thank you everyone for coming out, and have a wonderful day.